Of course, his primary goal was to somehow organize Vietnamese expatriates into a movement that would pressure the French government into improving conditions in his homeland.
People who encountered Ho Chi Minh in those days tended to say pretty much the same things. A very intense young man, very anxious to learn, very idealistic, a man very much driven by ideas. But what was remembered about him perhaps more than anything else was his sharp eyes that essentially seemed to penetrate the soul of the person who was talking to him.
Ho discovered that there were many Frenchmen who were sympathetic to his cause. These liberals encouraged him to join their socialist group and to write and publish his own ideas. Soon, Ho and other Vietnamese expatriates began publishing an anti-colonial newspaper directed toward the Vietnamese community in France. Their leaflets were even smuggled back to Vietnam.
All of his writings really are on that theme, what a rotten deal colonials are getting all over the French Empire, which indeed they were. Ho's point of thinking is, how do you fix this? Do you fix it with revolution? Do you fix it with violence? How do you do it?
Writing under the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen the Patriot, Ho simply advocated better treatment and equal rights for his people, not revolution. He achieved a near-legendary status in certain circles back in Vietnam, where his rhetoric was considered visionary. Ho also attracted the attention of the imperial regime back home. They accused him of inciting treason and condemned him to death if he ever returned to Vietnam. In 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson traveled to the Versailles Peace Conference to present his famous 14-point plan for world peace. Ho and his associates discovered that one of Wilson's key points was that all nations deserve the right to self-determination. Ho believed that this meant that the U.S. was advocating the end of the colonial system.
And Ho Chi Minh, thinking that this might apply to Vietnam, got himself all dressed up in a cutaway coat and striped pants and a top hat, and he went out to Versailles carrying with him a document that he had written, which was a kind of inventory of various cases of French repression in Vietnam. And his idea was to give this to Wilson so that the United States would then exert pressure on France. Well, he got very rudely rebuffed when he tried to go in to see Wilson or even deliver this.
Ho had believed that President Wilson would be sympathetic to Vietnam's plight. He was greatly disappointed that he was unable to present his case. This forced him to look elsewhere for help. A socialist showed Ho a paper that had been written by Vladimir Lenin. In it, the Soviet leader wrote that one of the keys to the spread of communism was the liberation of all colonies.
The Russians wanted to end colonialism not because they loved the people who were under colonial rule, but for their own selfish interests. They wanted to weaken the Western powers. But regardless of what their motivation was, they were the only power at the time to advocate it and to actively want to offer help.
And it's at that point, as he basically points out, that he determined to become a follower of Lenin, not because he had any understanding of Marxist ideology, but because he loved the strategy that Lenin had set forth as a means of liberating the colonial peoples.
In 1920, Ho became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party. He was 30 years old. He had become a great propagandist while living in Paris, but he wanted to learn how to turn rhetoric into revolutionary action. He believed there was really only one place to learn this craft: Moscow. In 1923, Ho received an invitation to join the Comintern, the organization set up by the Soviets to export Marxism and Leninism around the world. He jumped at the opportunity. He disappeared from Paris, leaving his friends wondering what had happened to him.
I think what drew Ho to Moscow first and foremost was nationalism, the desire to find help to liberate his country and his people.
Ho became an important member of the Comintern. He now took his orders from Moscow.
I always felt that Ho Chi Minh had very little time for Marxism as a philosophy, as a way of interpreting history. He had great admiration for Leninism and the techniques and the methods to be used.
The rest of the world may have abhorred Lenin's tactics, but Ho was devoted to them. He believed that he had found the blueprint for liberating his homeland. Ho received his first international assignment when he was sent to Canton in South China to help organize communist cadres. It was here that he also began a clandestine lifestyle that would last nearly 30 years.
He went underground, so to speak. And you have him wandering around the world under a wide variety of aliases. Some of them Vietnamese, some of them Chinese, depending on where he was and what purpose he needed. If, for example, he contributed to a French newspaper, he'd call himself Victor Le Bon. If he contributed to a Russian newspaper, he'd call himself Nafransky, and so forth.
In 1927, Ho was nearly arrested when the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists. Ho narrowly escaped capture and a likely death sentence, and eventually made his way to Siam, or present-day Thailand. He avoided detection by agents of the Sûreté, or French secret police, via a clever ruse. He learned some Thai, shaved his head, donned a saffron robe, and traveled as a Buddhist monk. There was a large Vietnamese community living in northeast Thailand, so Ho preached his cause as he wandered from village to village in disguise.
I don't know of any other leader of his stature having done this kind of masquerading under different guises, or having had to change his name so many times, which makes me wonder whether this was just a necessity, or was it the sense of the drama in the man that prompted him to do this.
For most of the 1930s, Ho's whereabouts were not known. He had even been reported dead.
Ho just disappeared. He was either in the cave of Yan'an with Mao, he was in a Stalin jail. There's no world figure that you can say that we don't know where he was for almost a decade. And again, this was not accidental. I mean, he didn't want to be found.
Ho emerged again on the world stage shortly before the outbreak of World War II. He'd always believed that there would one day be a time when the conditions would be just right to begin the liberation of his homeland. When France fell to Germany in the early months of World War II, and the pro-German Vichy government took over the colonial rule of Vietnam, Ho believed that the moment had arrived. In early 1941, he slipped across the Chinese border and into the jungles of North Vietnam. Incredibly, this was the first time Ho had set foot in his homeland in over 30 years. He was armed only with his ideas, but he was determined to lead a revolution, to liberate his country, or to die trying. When Ho Chi Minh walked across the border into North Vietnam in 1941, it marked the first time he had set foot in his country since 1911. He had no weapons, almost no money, and very little support. But he was determined to organize a guerrilla movement that would drive the foreigners from his country.
He calls the movement the Viet Minh, which is an acronym for Independence League. And he takes for the first time this name Ho Chi Minh, which means roughly bringer of light. So Ho Chi Minh begins to exist under that name, the famous name, now, 1941.
Well, there seems to be something of a myth that Ho Chi Minh, when he came back to Vietnam after 30 years of absence, was looked upon by, quote, everybody as the leader of Vietnam. I doubt that that's the case, because there was not the kind of media ability to influence the thought of people in the countryside. At that time, 90, maybe 95% of the people in Vietnam lived in small villages and cultivated rice.
There were educated Vietnamese in big cities like Hanoi and Saigon who greatly admired Ho's writings under his pen name Nguyen the Patriot. But they were in the minority. The vast majority of the people in the country were not familiar with Ho or his work. In fact, most of them could not read.
So his main aim was how to communicate and become close to the peasants. So he managed to adopt this very populist style, talking very simply to the peasants and being like an uncle, you know, a member of the family.
Ho brought the role that his father had played as the avuncular village mandarin or local public official to a national level. Though some critics believe that this persona was nothing short of a calculated act, it was effective and the movement gained momentum.
I think Ho Chi Minh's goal determined his behavior. In order to reach the masses, he had to be looking and acting and living like a peasant, to be in communion with the needs of the peasants.